Welcome back to KSP and our fully reusable moonship. We have a reusable first stage booster, a reusable second stage, and a reusable lunar lander. As always, we started off with some low altitude and orbital landing tests of the individual stages, and of course we had some disasters along the way. So let's enjoy those first. Eventually we did master the art of landing all of our stages propulsively from orbit back at the Space Center. Knowing that every stage of a vehicle is reusable, provided we can get it back to Earth, means we can focus on the next stage of our adventure, which is getting to the Moon. Our initial plan was for the first stage to take the vehicle to orbit and then return to Earth. The second stage would carry the capsule to the Moon and then separate and return to Earth. The capsule would then go onto the Moon, land on, then take off from the lunar surface before eventually coming back home. Getting to the Moon itself is fairly easy. The first difficult part is landing on it, so let's see how those early attempts went. Eventually we did make a successful landing on the lunar surface. We were even able to take off from the Moon and return to lunar orbit. And just to prove that it was repeatable, we carried out another couple of landings and takeoffs from the Moon before we focused on the next problem, which was getting back home. Of course, the first stage booster, which only ever went into Earth orbit, got back home with no difficulty at all. But bringing back the second stage and lunar lander, which were both in lunar orbit, that was a whole different story. The problem with the second stage was by the time we got back into Earth's sphere of influence, we just didn't have enough fuel to slow ourselves down before re-entry. The problem the lunar lander had was that the vehicle was unstable as soon as it entered the atmosphere. To make things even more difficult, it was hard to predict where the capsule would land, and we wanted to avoid water because we were going for full propulsive landings. So let's find out how these problems were solved. Welcome to the first successful flight of our fully reusable moonship. We're going to cover the entire flight. So takeoff and ascent through the atmosphere were good. The vehicle now enters a coast phase before its orbital insertion burn. The RCS thrusters position the vehicle in the correct orientation for the burn. The vehicle is in orbit and the first stage has separated for return to Earth. We wait until the first stage is in the optimum position for its deorbit burn. You can see it here just coming round the back of the planet, and as soon as it comes back round this side, we will perform the deorbit burn. The RCS fires to align the vehicle retrograde for its deorbit burn. The burn will be performed in map view, and we will target the Space Center as our landing site. The burn begins, and when the red X is over the Space Center, that's when we know we're on the correct trajectory. You can hear the RCS firing and keeping the vehicle stable during the deorbit burn. The first stage has enough fuel to get to orbit to perform a deorbit burn and to make a propulsive landing with a small amount of margin in the tanks. With the deorbit burn complete, we will watch the vehicle's re-entry to a propulsive landing. As we approach the atmosphere, the RCS on the first stage fires to make sure we're in the correct retrograde orientation for our re-entry. There are so many things that have to go right for a successful spaceflight. The deorbit burn has to be precise, the vehicle has to be positioned correctly when it re-enters, or it will end up off course. But all seems to be looking good, and we should be on for a landing at the Space Center. This first stage re-enters in a much more stable way than my previous vehicles as well, so we know that if we aim at the Space Center, we're going to land there. Although temperatures continue to build as the atmosphere thickens, the vehicle stays healthy and the heat shields work. Once the Space Center is in sight, we'll be able to look at our predicted landing point and see if it looks good. The RCS continues to fire during descent to keep the vehicle correctly positioned. As we make it through the atmosphere, we can extend the grid fins and prepare for landing. As the vehicle positions itself for landing, you can see the variance between our desired landing site and our actual landing site reduces. And we have successfully recovered our first stage booster at the Space Center. It's time to rejoin our second stage at the time of separation for its lunar injection burn. After separation from the first stage, the second stage has a short coast phase. After this coast phase, it will perform the lunar injection burn, which will carry it towards the moon. Once the burn is complete, we'll actually separate the second stage from the capsule. The capsule will then continue to the moon, and the second stage will return to Earth. The second stage burn has now put the capsule on a trajectory towards the moon. With its job complete, we turn the second stage around and will return it to Earth. Once the second stage is retrograde, we will perform its deorbit burn and bring it back near the Space Center. Of course, the second stage will then make a propulsive landing ready for reuse. We bring the second stage back at this point for two reasons. The first is that it's simply not required for any of the lunar operations. The second is that it's much easier to bring the second stage back from an Earth escape trajectory than it is from lunar orbit. It also requires a lot less fuel. With the second stage correctly positioned, it begins its descent through the atmosphere for its landing. Of course, the RCS continues to fire during descent, but this second stage is very stable, so it won't have much to do. With a light fuel load, some grid fins, and a fairly beefy engine, we shouldn't have a problem making a propulsive landing at the Space Center. Most of our success for this adventure actually came from reducing weight, not adding fuel and power. Each stage only has the parts they absolutely need, and the amount of fuel that is required to do their job. As the atmosphere thickens, let's watch the second stage re-entry. Because it's returning from an escape trajectory, the second stage is moving a lot faster when it enters the atmosphere. This means that temperatures across the vehicle are higher. With grid fins extended, we activate the landing mode for the second stage. Because of the higher deorbit speeds, we do expect this landing to be a little bit further away from the space center, but it will still land near the center propulsively for easy recovery. RCS firing the whole way down and grid fins moving to keep the vehicle stable, all looks good. The vehicle speed continues to reduce before the eventual landing burns that will bring the stage down for a soft landing. With the second stage recovered, we will rejoin the lunar lander capsule at the point of separation as it begins its journey to the moon. In this map view, we can see the lander capsule, or stage 3, on its lunar intercept trajectory. We arm the lander engine so it's ready for its descent burn. When the lander is captured by the moon's gravity, we will begin our landing operations. And now the moon is pulling us in. With our autopilot set to land on the moon and the vehicle in its correct orientation, we wait until our landing burn height and hope for a successful landing on the moon. The lunar intercept and landing is very similar to the trajectories followed by the Apollo missions. The difference is that we're sending the entire vehicle to the moon's surface directly from our injection burn instead of parking in orbit and having a separate lander and command module. We did this purely so we could have the simplest possible fully reusable moonship. At about 100,000 feet from the lunar surface, our final descent begins. One of the many random elements of a moon flight is that you don't know where you're going to land, and if you land on a mountain, you're in trouble when it comes to leaving the lunar surface. So we're going to hope that we've got a fairly flat landing spot today. We continue in freefall to the lunar surface. Of course, we haven't got the grid fins extended because there's no atmosphere on the moon, but those fins will be useful for our eventual landing back on Earth. The descent engine will lie close to the surface for our landing, and we'll use that same descent engine for our lunar ascent back to orbit. It's almost time for our final powered descent and landing burn on the moon, so let's watch. And successful touchdown on the lunar surface. Now it's time to go back home. We'll light the ascent engine and go for a 30-kilometer lunar orbit. Just like with an ascent from Earth, there is a brief coast phase before our final orbital insertion burn. We're almost at the final phase of the flight, which is to bring this capsule lander third stage back to Earth to join the first and second stages of the vehicle, which have already landed. When all stages of the vehicle are back home, we'll have successfully recovered our fully reusable moonship. With the insertion burn complete, we're now in a 30-kilometer orbit around the moon. The vehicle is now positioning for its next burn, which is the Earth injection burn. With the Earth injection burn complete, we are now on an escape trajectory from the moon. Once we are captured by the Earth's gravity, we'll return on a free return trajectory to the Earth. During this time, we'll make some final burns to ensure we position ourselves over land for our deorbit. We also want to make this trajectory as shallow as possible so we don't carry too much speed into the atmosphere and burn up. Although we have targeted the space center, because we'll have to make more deceleration burns, we'll probably come up a little bit short but still over land. As we get closer to the atmosphere, the vehicle makes sure it is correctly positioned in retrograde. We've left enough fuel for one more decel burn during re-entry. Just before re-entry, we retract the solar panels. We'll continue to make short burns to reduce our speed during re-entry, but we also need to leave fuel for our propulsive landing. That was quite a dynamic deorbit. We were constantly making burns to prevent the vehicle overheating, and even then we still ended up quite unstable in the final stages. But the vehicle is healthy and we've extended the fins and we are about to make our propulsive landing back home. So we are in the hilly region just short of the space center, but that's not too bad. It's fairly close to the center. The vehicle should still land softly. It may topple after landing because of the terrain, but that's not a problem. It can be taken back and reused as long as no damage is done. It's time for our final descent as we bring our lander stage back from the moon. Similar to the first and second stages, a final landing burn will happen once the legs have been extended and the vehicle is close to the ground. And as expected, some toppling on the terrain, but the vehicle is undamaged. We'll retract the fins and gear And so ends the first successful flight of our fully reusable moonship. We have delivered a lander to the moon and not only retrieved that, but also every single stage of the vehicle. Thank you for watching.